As a natural extension of dissecting the insurrection, it's worth stating that the incidents of January 6th were not only a kind of shock to the democratic system, a warning that violent extremists desire the overthrow of democracy, but that in fact we are seeing open source intelligence come of age. Because I remember on the day of, on January 6th, if not the days following, the internet mobilized to identify who these assholes were. Who were these people who thought that they could use violence to threaten democracy? Who were these people who, felt that they were entitled to use violence as a means to force other people to listen to them? That's where open source intelligence saw its moment of maturity to try to identify these people. I would like to take a moment to give a big shout out to our fellow traveler, Business Daddy. Thanks for the raid. We always appreciate your support. You're a valued member of our open source intelligence network. And part of what we do here at MetaViews is try to understand our world, but there's an ethical imperative to that, right? Open source intelligence as a methodology requires ethics, right? It requires responsibility. It requires a moral approach, because as with anything that's powerful, that power must be used responsibly. So I kind of felt an important follow-up to our discussion about dissecting the insurrection is this article about the dark side of open source intelligence. And this is an article that really looked at some of, unfortunately, what is tragic and endemic to open source intelligence, making mistakes, misidentifying people, right? Drawing conclusions from incomplete information rather than what happens in the real world of intelligence. They use things like probability. We think that this could be the guy, but we don't know. Unfortunately, on the internet, nuance is not as popular as sensationalism, right? Being uncertain about something is not as effective clickbait as being absolutely certain that you've got the guy. And that, I think, is the real difficult. Yes, Business Daddy points out, or on the court of Reddit, right? There is no due process in the court of Reddit. There is only the judge, jury, and executioner, all embodied in the same Redditor. So that's why, if we are going to celebrate open source intelligence, which we do here at MetaViews, if we are going to champion the dissecting of the insurrection, as we have in today's episode, then we also have to acknowledge the ethical or moral framework by which open source intelligence must be pursued. This article argues that internet sleuths have used publicly available data to track down the rioters of January 6th, but it illustrates a range of examples in which people were wrong, in which a number of people were misidentified and blamed for being in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol, when in fact they were never there. Now, this raises the need to always have an alibi, because in the court of Reddit, you will be found guilty. You will be guilty until proven innocent. So, does this mean that in a surveillance society, we always need to be surveilling ourselves and gathering our own data in our own defense? Because we never know when we're going to be confused with somebody else and accused of doing something we didn't do or being somewhere we weren't at? Admittedly, I indulge in a lot of paranoia, so I tend to think of these scenarios quite a bit. It's part of the reasons why I do share my Google location with my loved ones, so at least they know where I am, and I've always got a data trail to argue, where I was. Business Daddy points out you gotta save your punch-out reports and geodata. I mean, again, I'm hypothesizing, but if we reluctantly accept the idea that we live in a surveillance society, and we accept that algorithms are biased, often biased against us, and we know that the court of Reddit will not afford us the luxury of a fair defense, let alone, I don't even know if Reddit has public defense lawyers on staff. Maybe that should be something that we mandate that the platform has. I mean, this suggests that you should always be building up your own evidence to prove your own, site. Although Business Daddy does rightfully point out that you got to keep it secret. You got to keep it safe. Because if they know about your information, they can hack your information. Now, I do want to take a moment to do a little bit of a brag that if you put open source intelligence as a phrase in Google Scholar, and I'll increase the font here, you will notice that the second entry that is cited by 137 people, i.e. it has the largest number of citations, was co-authored by some guy named Jay Hirsch in 2002. Yes, that's right. I'm laying claim to it. I was one of the first to publish the definition of open source intelligence 19 years ago. That's right, 19 years ago, with my fellow traveler Felix Stalder, another valued member of the MetaViews network. We published a paper on open source intelligence, and it was our attempt to coin the term, to give academic credo to the concept. So I'm going to read our abstract. The open source movement has established over the last decade a new collaborative approach uniquely adapted to the internet, to developing high-quality informational products. Initially, its exclusive application was the development of software. But increasingly, we can observe this collaborative approach being applied to areas beyond the coding of software. One such area is the collaborative gathering and analysis of information, a practice we term open source intelligence. In this article, we use 3 case studies: the NetTime mailing list, which is still active today, the Wikipedia project, and the No Logo website, which I built in the late 90s. To show some the breadth of context and analyze the variety of socio-technical approaches that make up this emerging phenomenon. And so the irony here was we didn't actually invent the phrase open source intelligence. We just knew how the game is played. That whether it's search engine optimization or whether it's scholarly hacking, that if you're the first person to publish an article in the academic world that coins a phrase, well, then everyone else who writes about it after the fact has to cite your paper. And by current count, that's 137 papers. So these are all the different papers, gate watching, collaborative online news production, internet and society, social theory and the information age, tracking the flu pandemic by monitoring the social web, bastard culture, how user participation transformed culture. These are all people who are citing our paper because we had the wherewithal to publish it first. So I offer this as an insight. Business Daddy, if you're still here, you used the phrase the other day, narrative overlay, which I thought was a brilliant phrase. And I then Googled narrative overlay, and I didn't really find anything. So you should own that phrase. You should publish on some paper, some website, some blog, your analysis of what narrative overlay is. Because that way, 20 years later, people will still be citing it and linking to it as you on the authority. Now, the real reason that I wanted to mention kind of open source intelligence, both in the ethical and moral, was I've also been waiting for an opportunity to profile Bellingcat and Elliot Higgins. Because Bellingcat is perhaps one of the preeminent open source intelligence agencies currently operating openly. And it's an interesting story. This is an article from The Spectator in the UK about Elliot Higgins. It's all about a board business administrator in Leicester puts the intelligence services to shame. And this is a kind of preview and a review of Elliot Higgins' recent book that promos Bellingcat and promos their work. And it's an interesting premise that anyone could create their own intelligence agency. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bellingcat, but they do really interesting work. I mean, to read their about paragraph, Bellingcat is an independent international collective of researchers, investigators, and citizen journalists using open source and social media investigation to probe a variety of subjects, from Mexican drug lords and crimes against humanity to tracking the use of chemical weapons in conflicts worldwide. With staff and contributors in more than 20 countries around the world, we operate in a unique field where advanced technology, forensic research, journalism, investigations, transparency, and accountability all come together. And if you're still with us, Remedy Re-Up, it's interesting to note how they emphasized accountability and transparency, as one of the pillars of the framework that they use as part of the mandate or mission that they use for their work. Now, if you look at the kind of news that they currently have up there, it's some really interesting stuff. The U.S. connection to Venezuela's narco planes. The woman accused of stealing Nancy Pelosi's laptop appears in video making Nazi salute. The website sustaining Britain's far-right influencers. Vladimir Kara-Murza tailed by members of FSB squad prior to suspected poisonings. I mean, this is all really interesting stuff that, Remedy Re-Up, the same way that you were talking about the kind of decimation of the news industry and professional journalists. Well, Bellingcat's filling that void, right? Bellingcat is a legitimate, hardcore, investigative outfit that produces serious news as a result of their practices in open source intelligence. So I raise this both because I want to celebrate, champion, and promote the work of Bellingcat, but also because I aspire to do something similar.